This is the Jedburgh podcast. I'm the host, Fran Racioppi. Each episode, I speak with transformative leaders, visionaries, drivers of change, and those dedicated to winning, no matter the challenge. The Jedburgh podcast is founded in the lineage of the Special Operations Jedburgh teams of the past and is sponsored by Talent War Group, an executive search and talent advisory. Visit talentwargroup.com for more. A percentage of all proceeds is dedicated to the Special Operations Warrior Foundation. This episode is brought to you by Analytics. As owners of small to medium-sized businesses, we face tons of challenges in our companies. Imagine if our only role as owners was to focus on growing our business, not on all the other stuff that needs to get done. Analytics specializes in helping businesses succeed by doing just that, managing everything else. Analytics provides a deep bench of solutions to handle the most complex challenges in finance and accounting, IT, data management, AV, and healthcare. Around these services, they wrap Insight 360, a cloud-based portal that houses your company's financial and operational information. Insight 360 develops customized reports showing key metrics, benchmarks, and KPIs for better insight into your business's performance. Visit analytics.com for more information. That's analytix.com. Over 40 million people are the victims of human trafficking. It's the fastest growing crime in the world, a $150 billion industry, and disproportionately affects women and children. Mitzi Perdue is the founder of Win This Fight, a nonprofit dedicated to eradicating this vicious crime. Mitzi is also the daughter of Ernest Henderson, the founder of Sheraton Hotels. Her husband is the late Frank Perdue, the CEO of Perdue Farms and Perdue Chicken. Mitzi is also one of the most syndicated environmental journalists in history, the owner of Rice Farms and Wineries, and the former president of American Agri-Women, an organization of over 30,000 women leaders in agriculture. Mitzi joined me on this episode for a candid discussion on labor and sex trafficking, the effect it's taking on women and children, and how her nonprofit has pioneered a method of donation through auctioning high-value items their owners just don't really need. Join the fight to raise $100 million by visiting winthisfight.org. Mitzi and I reviewed the history of Sheraton's rise to the largest hotel chain in the world, the leadership required to build culture and community when acquiring distressed assets, and how airing your dirty laundry will destroy any family business. She also reminisced about her shotgun wedding to the Chicken King and his leadership principles, including no one is as smart as all of us, and every employee has a critical role to play in a company's success. And if you think this 80-year-old pioneer isn't willing to push herself for more, she explains her constant need for education, her current classes in business and public speaking, and she even calls out her rival in the battle for hotel heiress primacy, Heiress Hilton. Mitzi, welcome to the Jedburgh podcast.
What a complete joy to be with you. And I love the premise of your show. I mean, I'm just so honored to be here, and I'll give it my all, I promise.
Well, thanks. That's our goal. We don't have royalty in the U.S., but if we did, you, your family, the lineage that you come from would be at the top of that list to fill that gap for American royalty. You're the heiress to the Sheraton Hotel Chain, one of the world's most iconic brands started by your father. Your late husband was Frank Perdue, the chicken man, as he's called, and the former CEO of Perdue Farms, one of the leading chicken companies in the world. You're a self-made journalist, an author, a businesswoman, having started very successful businesses in rice and grape cultivation. Now you're heavily involved in philanthropy. You're a journalist, an author, a business consultant. I mean, these things that you have done are truly amazing. As you now speak about family-run businesses and how to make successful leaders, you take lessons from your own life. You take lessons from your father, from your late husband. Your father served in World War I. Your brother served in World War II. And we thank them for their service. And you're a fellow Bostonian. So we will always have that bond, which I love. But it really is truly an honor to be here with you today.
Well, the honor is entirely the other way around, but I'll take it.
Mitzi, we have so many things to talk about. We're going to talk about Sheraton Hotels. We're going to talk about the influence of your father. We're going to talk about Perdue Farms and your late husband, Frank Perdue. But I want to start with the initiative that you're involved in right now, and it ties to human trafficking. It's called Win This Fight. Can you describe what Win This Fight is?
Oh, I'd like nothing better. And I'm eager later on in the show to talk about my late father in Sheraton or my late husband in Perdue Farms. But human trafficking is one of the absolute worst atrocities that happens in the face of the earth. It's a $150 billion industry, and it's the second largest source of income for organized crime today. There's almost 1 million children who are being sex trafficked. And when you're a sex trafficked child, say you started at 10, your life expectancy is only 7 years. By 7 years, you will almost certainly be dead of an overdose or suicide, or how about having your organs harvested? So it's just an incredibly monstrous affliction for humanity. And I want to spend the rest of my time on Earth, and I'm 80. I want to spend the rest of my time on Earth combating this. By the way, I want to help win this fight. I'm not expecting that any one person can do it. I write a column once a week. I work for Psychology Today, and I write a column on human trafficking. And generally, the subjects are people who are working on doing something about it. And between Psychology Today and some other outlets that I write for, I've written at least 60 articles in the last couple of years. Actually, it's getting to probably 70 or 80 by now. But one thing that I've learned is that almost every anti-trafficking organization that exists, and there are tens of thousands of them, that all of them could use more money to deliver more services, but they also want more awareness of human trafficking. Because that every single person listening to us, if they're in a town of any size, they're probably within 5 or 10 miles of somebody who's being trafficked. And the life of a trafficked person, I was talking this morning, just before coming on your show, I was talking with policeman from Florida, and he was telling me, he's part of the Vice Squad, and he was telling me, some of the things that happen to people who are trafficked. And it's not like the movie Pretty Woman, where there's this beautiful prostitute who's wearing glorious clothes and being taken to the opera. No, it's more like a woman, and he said, we're going to call her Susan. But Susan, she was trafficked for 4 years. But if you're a trafficker, you'd really like to, quote, break, I'm making air quotes now, break the person that you're trafficking, so that she's so discouraged, so demoralized, that there's almost nothing left of her and she's on automatic pilot and she just does whatever you want. And he described the breaking of Susan. She had started out as a stripper, but a guy in the audience told her all these wonderful things about how pretty you are and how mature you are for your age, and I really want to be a friend with you. Well, that was grooming talk, and it was very effective because she'd never heard anybody say, oh, you're so smart, oh, you're so mature for your age, oh, you're so beautiful. And she just totally fell for it. That's the Romeo part of being a trafficker. But he quickly converted into the gorilla part. And Romeo gorilla is a typical progression that happens to a girl, probably to a boy too, but this is about Susan, so we'll stick with Susan. Within just a couple of days, he was selling her to his friends at parties. And then, to break her, he had a situation where there were 30 men, and they went at it with her 2 minutes per man. And then after she'd gone through 30 men in terrible pain, bleeding, then they just began beating her up. One of them was using the handle of a broom to beat her. And she said that she, describing it to the policeman whom I was interviewing this morning, she told him, I just felt like a piece of raw hamburger. There was no dignity. It was as if I had died. And at that point, she didn't even bother to fight him. And by the way, he was convincing her in every interaction that he had with her that she deserved this and that she wasn't worthy of anything better. And that's how she began to think of herself. So, I think it's the most evil thing in the whole world. So anything that I can do to help combat this, and my 2 ways are raising money, but the raising money is working. We have a project called Support Our Survivors. And the goal eventually is to go to every state in the United States and find an anti-trafficking organization that restores women or men who've been trafficked. And typically it takes a year, maybe 2 years. Support Our Survivors raises $20,000 and gives a check to the organizations that is working to restore the victims of trafficking. And the point of giving them a $20,000 check is, I'll tell you how it's working in New Jersey. They have already arranged for radio, television, newspaper, podcasts, even billboards to cover the $20,000 check. Am I handing it over? And the New Jersey state legislature is even going to be introducing anti-trafficking legislation. So the $20,000, which has just been raised by people who send in. Actually, can I give everybody a text number that they can text the word?
Yeah, absolutely. Please.
No, let's make it elevate. Text elevate to 55312. And we have 6 in the pipeline right now, but the donations have come $5 at a time, but hundreds and hundreds of them just by, if you text elevate to 55312, you're given an opportunity to make a recommended donation of $5. And quite a few people give a lot more. But like just in the last week, it's been like $34,000 that have come in. So my experience is that people hear about this, they want to do something. Well, here's a way to do something.
Oh, absolutely. And we're gonna put it on all of our stuff, all of our promotional stuff for this episode when we kick it out. Elevate to 55312. There's 2 kinds of human trafficking. You spoke about sex trafficking, and some of the stats behind that. Women and girls make up 96% of the victims of sex trafficking, but sex trafficking is also 71% of all human trafficking. 52% involve children right here in the U.S. So this is not, and not only is this this is something that happens globally, but this is an issue here in the U.S. as well. And 99 billion of the 150 billion, almost greater than 2/3, is going to sex trafficking. It's one of the world's fastest growing crimes. But then there's also labor, and the labor trafficking piece, which is labor traffickers in many forms, debt bondage, forced labor, involuntary child labor. You see this in industries like construction, manufacturing, mining, hospitality. There's an example that you've used of a worker who was paid $808 for a 78-hour work week in Germany, but according to law, a 39-hour work week should have been paid over $2,500. So the labor piece is also a big part of this.
Yeah, and in some cases, they're paid something. But I'm thinking of a story I did recently on Malaysia and coconut oil. I think I'm trying to say palm oil. They're huge, giant plantations where the people are paid nothing. And you can make a pretty big profit if you have all this labor and they're paid nothing.
Well, in the hospitality, labor is the highest cost, labor and food. You know that if you eliminate that labor cost, it's all profit.
You're making money hand over fist.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but the United States is doing something just admirable, which is we have laws which are being are being enforced, are being acted upon, where the United States, if they find like there's a palm oil company in Malaysia, they have the ability, and they're doing this, to block entry into the United States market. And that means that, well, like Hershey's, I think they use palm oil. Hershey's will stop using any product that we can prove was made with slave labor. But the U.S. government can even keep it from getting into the country. And the huge, wonderful benefit of that is if you've got one of these great, giant palm oil plantations, it's a fast way ticket to bankruptcy if you can't sell to the Americans. So you have to change your labor practices, and you're not going to get cleared until somebody from the U.S. government or somebody can prove that it's not slave labor anymore. So going after them economically is remarkably effective.
You've highlighted fundraising for this initiative in ways that those of us who don't have tremendous amount of money can donate, $5, $10, whatever we feel comfortable with, to as much money as we want. But you also created a model for this program, for Win This Fight, that was based on the auction of goods or the sale of goods outside of cash and to generate cash. And can you talk about that? Because this is really unique, and this is a really great opportunity that you saw in this, coming from your background, where I think you look around and you see all these assets and you say, wow, these assets are worth a lot of money. Do I really need them? And if I don't need them, can I give them away and put the money to charity?
Yeah, and get a tax deduction. When I first started Win This Fight, I wanted to give a great big personal check to combating human trafficking. But as I kind of looked around where my charitable stuff is, I realized if I'm writing one great big check to a new charity, I'm going to have to cut back on like the food bank or Red Cross or other things that I'm already committed to, or certain environmental things. And I'm thinking, who do I cut back? Who do I cut back? And then I had this idea. I inherited what we think is a desk that belonged to a de Medici cardinal probably 500 years ago. And I thought I could sell that. I had an idea what it's worth. And you could rescue 100 children if we auctioned that. And I'm thinking, oh boy, would I rather have this desk that I inherited, or would I rather save 100 children? And guess which one out? But then I thought, if I'm in that situation where it's hard for me to write a big check without cutting back someplace else, there have to be a whole lot of other people, like movie stars or sports stars or your friendly neighborhood billionaire, of which I know you've got 37. Well, okay, you don't, but the person listening to me does.
Yeah. I wish I knew 37 billionaires.
But in any case, the idea was to ask them to donate items that would be sold, and they could say which anti-trafficking organization it would go to. The only thing is, this is sort of on hold because COVID-19 meant the economy was a little bit uncertain. And the people who advised me, and there's some really smart people that I respect a whole lot, people in finance, people from banks, said, wait until COVID-19 is in the rearview mirror before you schedule a year ahead of time an auction. So we have something better. This is one of those examples of one door shuts, another bursts open. Instead of asking people to sell items in one great big auction, instead, there's a guy who wants to auction rental jewelry. So maybe like one of the donations, it's $1 million necklace that belonged to Marlene Dietrich. And in case your wife wants to wear a $1 million necklace to her next big party, you're going to the Oscars. I know everybody told me about that.
Oh, I wish. But I'm going to have to keep her away for this episode because she's going to take you up on this.
But supposing you're one of those 37 billionaire friends that you have living in your town, supposing a wife of one of them is going to the Oscars or the Met Gala or something, and he could afford to buy $1 million necklace, but that's not a good investment if you're only going to wear it twice. Or in the course of a year, you don't get to wear it. The amortization of the use of this thing is not high. But if you could rent it, it could make sense. I mean, maybe it's a really big event in your life, like you just sold your company for $100 million and you want to celebrate. Well, the idea is you rent high value, knock your eyes out jewelry. And I'm going to put up my Atocha emerald, which is my engagement ring. Anyway, the hope is that people will be even more forthcoming to, instead of spending $1 million, I don't know what it will rent for. We'll have to see how it works. But supposing you could wear something just astonishing to remember the rest of your life for $20,000, but the owner still gets to keep their goodie. It would raise money, it would raise awareness, and it would be a lot of fun.
Yeah, and it's really impactful to the cause.
Well, $20,000 to a typical anti-trafficking organization, they're giant ones with budgets of tens of millions, but a lot of them that I come across, their budget might be $200,000, and you suddenly get $20,000 in addition. Boy, that it's amazing to them.
Yeah, that's meaningful numbers. I want to start with the Sheraton Hotel Chain and your father, Ernest Henderson. And I'm going to give a little bit of quick history on the chain. In 1933, Harvard classmates Ernest Henderson, your father, Robert, and his partner, Robert Moore, purchased Continental Hotel in Cambridge, Massachusetts. That's their first hotel. 1944, they bought the Copley Plaza Hotel. I've spent a good amount of time in and out of there. 1947, the Sheraton becomes the first hotel chain to be listed on the New York Stock Exchange. 1949, first hotel chain to use the Telex reservation system. 1962, you open the franchise division. 1985, first international hotel chain to operate in China. 1987, now it's the largest hotel chain in the world. An amazing growth path in really a relatively short time, if you look at companies that have existed over decades and decades. But the success of the franchise has been credited to the relationship that initially began between your father and his business partner, Robert Moore. And that was a relationship that set the culture for the company, and it really continues to resonate today. You see examples all over of founders who are best friends. There's tight-knit families, but there's also founders who argue. They publicly go at each other. They work on different agendas. I've seen this even in my own experience. And I'm wondering from your perspective, as you watched this growth, as you watched this occur, what was so important about their relationship that set the company up for success?
Well, my father met the person who became his business partner for life almost the first day. He was a Harvard undergraduate, and he met the person that we call Uncle Bob. And he said they've just been really close friends. But there's even an added dimension to this, which is, I remember when I was maybe 10 years old and starting a new school. And I hadn't slept that night because I was starting a new school. It's unsettling. And my father picked it up the next morning that I hadn't slept well and that I was unhappy. And of course, he asked what's wrong. And I said, I'm afraid nobody will like me. And Father said 2 points. He said, first of all, you're a likable kid and they will like you. And second, you don't need a lot of friends. In fact, in my life, I only have one, other than family members, I only have one close friend, and that's Uncle Bob. So it wasn't just close. It was his only real friend that he could let his hair down with and tell everything, worry with or whatever. Otherwise, according to what he told me, he only had one friend his whole life.
And that bond is what then resonated really throughout the company.
Well, I want to add something else to it, which is when my father died, and we did sell the chain shortly after my father's death, but Uncle Bob attended the funeral. And that time I was probably, 26 or something. And I'm not a terribly observant person, but even I could see that Uncle Bob was just a ghost. I mean, he was pale, he was trembling, sort of to make conversation with him at this hugely emotional moment where he's lost his best friend. I asked him, what was it like with my father? Did you quarrel a lot? And he said, no, it would have been impossible to quarrel. It would be, and then he held up his left hand and his right hand. And he said, it would be like having your left hand quarrel with your right hand. It can't be done.
That's how close they were.
So that's how close they were.
You referenced your father's ability to inspire people and drive them to elite performance. On the Jedburgh podcast here, we define characteristics of elite performance in terms of drive, resiliency, adaptability, humility, integrity, effective intelligence, team ability, curiosity, and emotional strength. Your father and Robert started the business in the Great Depression when hotels were going bankrupt and closing. No one was going to hotels and spending money. And the business model, to some extent, was to buy some of these depressed hotels, some of the ones that were failing, going into bankruptcy, and then turn them around. They started with 0 employees. They grew to 400 locations, 20,000 employees at the time of your father's death. And your father believed that a leader's job was to give people a better vision of themselves. A good portion of my work in change management and turnaround strategy and operations is about making people better. The people are the core of everything. We say that in special operations. People are more important than hardware. Your father had a quote in which he said, employees at every level are what will determine the success or failure of a company. People will live up to or down to your expectations. Can you speak a bit more about that? I think that's truly fascinating because it is the expectations of the leader, but then it has to be executed on and they have to hold people accountable.
All right. I know the answer to this because I asked him. Because as a little girl, maybe 10 or 12, it was so clear to me that, my daddy was a really successful guy. I mean, my little friends didn't have houses with a ballroom that held 200 people. So it was clear to me as can be that daddy was a really successful guy. So I'm always asking him. And the overall answer that he would give always was it's the people who work with us. But within that, and now we're zeroing into answering your question, he told me how he made that happen. And here's a story that he told me. He said whenever he'd take over a hotel, and this being at least at the period that we're describing, it was the height of the Great Depression, 25% unemployment. And he knew that all the employees of whatever hotel that he had just taken over were probably terrified that they were going to lose their job. And if you lost your job back then, it meant the breadline. You couldn't just go out and get another job. So the day that he'd take possession of a hotel, he'd invite all the employees to come into the hotel ballroom. And he told me that he knew they would have great difficulty listening to a single word he said because they would so much have in their mind, what today's the day I'm going to get fired. What am I going to tell my spouse? How am I going to put food on the table? They were just a totally demoralized group of people. Father knew that. And so, he stands up at the stage of the ballroom and takes the mic. And the first words out of his mouth every time were, and he's looking at his whole audience, and he says, I want every one of you to keep your job. And, at that point, there's a great gasp of relief from everybody. And his next words were, I have a reason for wanting you to keep your job. Because you know your job better than anybody else in the world. And my job is to give you the resources and the encouragement to show the world just how good you are. And he said, you'll see in just a few months, we all know this hotel has been on the verge of bankruptcy, but you'll see in just a few months, this becomes the most successful hotel in the city. We, as a team, are going to be the creators of the most successful hotel in the city. We're going to be an inspiration to people that, even though it's down times, discouraging times, there's hope. The hotel's going to be the most popular, the best served, the most financially stable. And this team is going to make it happen. Cool?
It was interesting to learn about this because I noticed that he actually then would take concrete steps into proving that to the employees, because getting up in front of everyone and telling them, this is what we're going to do, right? You still have to come through. You still have to prove that you're not getting fired. And so it was interesting because he would make investments in the employee spaces first.
Well, Fran, you have absolutely zeroed in on what I take to be the most important part of this, which is, he told me words aren't enough. He said the next day, the employees would see just cavalcades of people coming in, decorators, plumbers, electricians, to refurbish the hotel. Because if a hotel has been neglected and on the verge of bankruptcy for a long time, it's kind of gone to seed. And so you have to invest money in bringing it up to an attractive state. But Father told me that all those electricians, decorators, plumbers, whoever else, they wouldn't go to the areas that the public would see. No, they'd go to the areas that only the employees would see, like the employee dining room, the employee lockers, showers. He deliberately spent the first money that he ever spent on any hotel he ever bought on upgrading and sprucing up the places that were only the employees would see. And he said the reason to do that was to communicate to the employees how important they were to him, how much he valued them.
And there's 3 ways that you've quantified employee engagement: intimidation, bribery, and inspiration. So I'm wondering if you can break those 3 down, because I think that they're genius if you think about so many leaders who get up, because you really only have like those 3 ways there. I don't know of it really any other way to stand up in front of a group of folks and say, this is how we're going to get things done.
Actually, what you just told me is really cool for me to hear, because I didn't know. I mean, maybe there are 100 ways to get people to do what you want. But in his world, there were 3. And 2 of them he felt were really, don't use them. They're not good. And 1 was the answer. And the first one, you mentioned intimidation. And he told me, that first day he could have stood up in front of everybody and said, shape up or you're fired. And he told me, you probably could get people to do what you want. You really could, except they'll do it grudgingly and they'll do the least that they can get by with, and their heart's not in it. So he said, and again, in his world, there were 3, and I'm delighted to hear that's generally accepted. But the second way was bribery. He said, I could have stood up there in front of them all and I could have said, do a really great job and there's a raise in it for you. Do a really good job and there's a bonus in it for you. But he also said that the problem with that is people don't stay bribed. You have to keep upping the ante. And then on top of that, people work for the bribe rather than for the good of the whole organization. So those 2 aren't good. The third one that you mentioned, inspiration, is, he felt, the answer. Because if everybody, when he was standing up in front of them and telling them, as a team, we're going to make this a shining example that things can turn around, that means that the woman who's, making beds, or the bartender who's pouring drinks, they're not just making beds or pouring drinks. No, they're part of this great big team that's going to turn this failing enterprise around and make it an inspiration to the rest of the city. And by gosh, that's what regularly happened. And the hotels became so successful with this model that with the money that he'd make from one, he'd go buy another until there were 400.
Well, it's empowering. It's empowering to the team because he was able to stand up there and he was to show them that their part, however, it's easy as a leader to stand up in front of an organization, especially a complex organization like a hotel chain, and say, well, you have a very small part because you wash dishes or you make beds. But in that person's world, that is the very big part. That's everything that they do. And a lot of times as leaders, we forget that. We forget that what we may see as a small cog in the wheel, even if it's a critical cog in the wheel, is to that person who executes that every day, that's their world. That's their big wheel. And the ability as a leader to stand up in front of everyone and say, this is why what you do, regardless of what it is so critical to the team and the team's success.
I thought Father's great gift was understanding enough of human nature to realize that make people feel important, make people feel valued, treasured. And to quote what you said a little while before, people have a compulsion, and these are his words, people have a compulsion to live up to or down to your expectations. And he proved it. His whole life was a proof of that.
I think about the first one too, intimidation. Because intimidation, you're right. You can go up there and say, you're going to do it or you're going to get fired or you're not going to get this. But there's also intimidation, which is more subtle. There's intimidation of I'm the boss. And because I'm the boss, you're going to do what I say. And I think that's very common. That's very common in a lot of younger leaders. It's I was a victim of that. I know that I did it myself as I look back, and I've internalized, different conversations I have, different ways I've approached entering organizations when I was a young leader in the military. And I tell a story about this where I walked in and I thought that I was the greatest thing that was ever going to come to this unit, and very quickly was humbled by this organization of folks who'd been there for a very long time and had tremendous more experience than I did. And you come in and say, well, I'm the boss now, I have the rank, and now everybody here is going to do what I say. But that doesn't work.
No, you have to have them engaged and want to do it. And therefore, inspiration is the way. I thought it was just genius on his part. And I think the techniques he used, as far as I can tell, he invented them, because I'm unaware of any of his competitors doing anything like that. But the idea is, if you have a whole team working together for something bigger than themselves, first of all, everybody's happier. I mean, if you're focused on what can I get out of this, probably going to be disappointed and miserable. On the other hand, if you're part of a team that's building something successful, you're energized and you want to come to work.
Yeah, and that's the bribery aspect. If you give me a little, I want more. And then you need more to get me to do the same thing. And then when you up it, then to do the same thing again, I need more than you gave me last time.
Except that I'm going to say that it was the inspiration of we're a winning team. He very much believed that people wanted to be on winning teams. I mean, the whole camaraderie of you're working together in something bigger than yourself, that's motivating, especially if you're valued.
Oh, absolutely. So transition in business is difficult. Mergers and acquisitions and exits exist in order for the seller to move on, right? For whatever that reason may be. But it's very stressful on both the buyers and the sellers. I'm running a project right now where I'm leading the acquisition strategy of our family business in the acquisition of another family business. And there's tensions and emotions on both sides of that thing. Your family had to come to the decision to exit the Sheraton brand. And there's a lot of emotion behind that. You have many brothers and sisters. So there's a lot of different personalities, a lot of different perspectives. And I know that when those conversations initially started, it wasn't everybody sitting around the table saying, yep, this is exactly what we're going to do. And this is the way we're going to do it. And so I'm hoping you can maybe tell the story about how those conversations went and how you came together as a group when initially you started in very different positions, and a very emotional event for a lot of folks.
Yeah, I would say that the emotions involved were white hot. And the reason why is, well, when you have a division that has to do with your identity, and we see that in politics, by the way, if you're to the left or to the right, boy, that's who you are. Well, if you're a family-owned business and you're the Sheraton family, giving that up. There are 3 sisters, of which I'm one, of course, and 2 brothers. And the sisters, we didn't want to sell. For us, it was our identity. We felt that nobody would care more about the employees than we would. We felt it was stomping on Father's grave, practically. So, yeah, we really strongly didn't want to sell the company. But I have 2 brothers who are both business school graduates. And through a lot of, I would say, almost fiery discussions, they eventually did convince the sisters to sell. And the way our family makes decisions, I mean, it's going to vary, but in general, if it's a great big decision, we want it to be by consensus. But we have a rule in the family, which I recommend to any family business at all, which is we don't take our quarrels public. And the way we phrased it was, we don't wash our dirty linen in public. And then the other part is we don't go to adversarial lawyers. I mean, we can go to lawyers who will advise the whole family what to do, but there's not going to be one lawyer representing me against my brother. That, I think, pretty much couldn't happen according to our family culture. Well, so eventually the brothers were able to point out why it would be really good for the company, really good for us, just absolutely the right thing to do. And we did sell. But the advantage to us of having solved it by consensus means that now, golly, how many years later? Probably 60 years later. Well, I can't do math in my head that fast, but we still have family reunions. We still love each other as a family. We still invest together. And that wouldn't have happened if we had allowed the quarrel to go public or to get adversarial lawyers with us fighting at each other.
I think that's a really interesting part of this conversation because it is so easy in a high profile family to have those things exposed. I mean, as a journalist, you can certainly appreciate that there's a need to have the story, have the scandal, get the scandal out there, and everybody would have loved to have that scandal. And I think about the Hilton family, right? The maybe the nemesis of the Sheraton family.
Well, actually, I have a little inside baseball story, but
oh, please.
Well, we grew up kind of looking over our shoulders at the Hiltons and sort of getting our identity a little bit by that we were different. I have a brother who's the same age as Nikki Hilton, which means that if they were both alive, they would be in their 90s. Yeah, one morning, we read in newspapers or however we heard that Nikki Hilton had married Elizabeth Taylor. And so my brother Ernest says to my father, "Daddy, buy me one of those." So we were extremely conscious of them. But as good Bostonians, we were much more low-key than the Texan Hiltons. And by the way, my son lives in Texas now, so I love Texas. But marrying movie stars and so forth was just not going to happen in our world. And having a public quarrel didn't happen. I was so fascinated that Paris Hilton, Hotel Heiress, sort of like somewhat in my position, but 100,000 million times more beautiful. But I'm not sure whether it was her father or her grandfather gave 97% of the Hilton Hotel fortune to a Catholic charity, deliberately and publicly disinheriting her for dishonoring the Hilton name. I think that just couldn't happen with the Hendersons.
Yeah, that was the grandfather, if I remember correctly. It was just a couple of years ago.
Yeah. Actually, I would love to meet Paris Hilton, just because we grew up in somewhat similar ways, but also very different ways. But I do think I admire her business success. I'm not sure that there are many women more beautiful than her. She's got star quality, so I admire her.
We'll make that a request to the Jedburgh podcast team, to make that introduction for you, to track her down and make you that introduction.
Well, I think we'd both enjoy it.
Although you may have a better time getting in touch with her than we would.
I've never tried, but I do think it would be fun. But one problem I'd have in trying to get to her is probably the same problem some people have in getting to me, which is I'm so skeptical. If I were Paris Hilton, I was reading that Mitzi Perdue wanted to meet her, that she's a Sheraton heiress, I wouldn't believe it. Well, because there's so many fakes in this world. You wouldn't believe how many fakes. Oh.
No, you're right. I hesitate every time I have to reach out to somebody and try to think about how am I going to phrase that this is real. You can actually believe that this is not a fake. I get it. Let's talk about Frank Perdue and Perdue Farms. And a little bit of background on Perdue Farms. Arthur Perdue, Frank's father, founded the company in 1920, selling eggs and then later chickens. 1939, Frank Perdue leaves what could have been a baseball career to become the second paid employee there. 1969, they opened the first processing plant. 70s, 80s, 90s, they scaled the business nationally and internationally. And then in the 2000s, they lead the industry in a move away from antibiotics. And then now, as we sit here today, 21,000 employees, $7 billion in annual revenue, fourth generation leading that company. And we know the stories of, the first generation builds it, the second generation does okay, the third one loses the business. And so to have the fourth generation is truly amazing. And he and your father shared a lot of the same or similar leadership qualities and principles. And that was something that you've said attracted you to Frank in the first place. And this was a really interesting love affair that you had with Frank. This episode is brought to you by Analytics. Whatever industry you're in, Analytics has a group of experts with experience bringing efficiency, transparency, and analysis to your business performance. This includes franchises, restaurants, hotels and hospitality, professional services, e-commerce, startups, and retail. People and collaboration are two of the most important factors in running a successful company. Whether it's private label service, collaboration, or direct engagement with your customers, analytics can be involved in your client relationships, or they can complete all that other stuff and let you take the credit for it. Visit analytics.com for more information. That's analytix.com. And it's a story that may resonate well, actually, as we come out of COVID with long distances and people locked down and far apart from each other, having to build meaningful and long-lasting relationships. I can't tell the story. I think you should tell the story. But talk about meeting Frank Perdue, the relationship that you had, and then this, I hesitate to call it a shotgun marriage, but this very quick marriage.
Well, we met in 1988. I was living in California growing rice, and he was living in Maryland growing chickens. And there was a party in Washington, D.C., where he arrived late. I had to leave early. We only overlapped by 10 minutes. But in that 10 minutes it took, the first 5 minutes we're talking, we both discovered very quickly that we were divorced. And we began talking about how we would never consider the thought of the notion of the possibility of considering remarrying. But then somewhere like 5 minutes into it, we began talking about how, well, that means growing old alone, how sad that is. But we didn't have a choice because we'd never trust anybody again. And then Frank looked down at me and he said, I believe I could trust you. And I looked up at him and I said, I believe I could trust you. And then the next 4 minutes were spent describing what our marriage would be like. It would be supportive and not competitive and would be there for each other during the good times and the bad. And then I had to leave. And I was actually on a speaking tour because I was president of American Agri-Women at that point. We didn't have internet, so I hadn't given him a number where to reach me. So I didn't talk to him again for 10 days until I returned to California. And there on my desk were all these pink while you were out slips, probably, I guess, 10 or 12 of them, Frank Perdue calling. And his first words when he called again were, I've never been more serious in my life. And I said, me too. And when we actually married, we had known each other in person only 6 weeks and 3 days. And it was blissfully happy. But back to your point about the long distance relationships, I recommend that to everybody. It sure did well by us because we'd talk for an hour or two every night. And during that time, when a physical relationship isn't there, you get into a whole lot of things that maybe you might not if you were just jumping in bed with each other. So we talked about our morals, our values, our aspirations, what his day had been like. When we did marry and we're living together, I felt there was no adjustment period. I thought the person who had presented himself on the phone was exactly and precisely the same person who had presented himself in person. And by the way, he gave me my engagement ring, the Atocha Emerald, when I'd known him. I came back to see him after like 6 weeks or so. And he gave me my engagement ring after we'd known each other 5 hours.
You've quoted William James in your reference to Frank's leadership style, saying that the deepest principle in human nature is the craving for appreciation. I'm reminded when I hear that quote of a conversation we had in early episodes with Peter Cancro, the founder and CEO of Jersey Mike's, where he speaks about a culture of giving and building a company on a culture of giving, and that the investment into employees, the investment into franchisees is the reason for the success. And that's how they've gone from one store on the Jersey Shore to 2,000 stores across the world and $2 billion in revenue this year. I think about that when I hear the story of Frank Perdue and the culture, but you were instrumental in shaping that culture. You went to Frank early on in your relationship and spoke to him about things you could do, events you could hold to build culture. And you're the one who really drove that forward and to drive that sense of community. And so can you talk about your ideas behind that, how you pitched that to him, and then what you actually did to build a community in Perdue Farms?
Okay, I don't want to grab more, credit than is due, but I will tell you what I did do. When we had just gotten back from our honeymoon, had not known each other in person very long, I suddenly sprung on him the idea that I think we should entertain every single person who works for the Perdue company. And he said, that's not possible. There's 16,000, which it was at the time. And I said, as if I hadn't understood that he had just said no, I said, and I think we could have them 100 at a time. No, that's way too many. I bet we could have them 3 times a month, 100 at a time. No. And then I said, I bet we could put it together in 6 weeks. No, that's completely impossible. But we kept going round and round with him saying no to my idea of entertaining everybody who worked for the company. But as we continued to talk about it, I could see that his attitude was changing from this is a really wacko idea to maybe there's something to it, till finally I like it. And I know why he was initially very resistant, because at heart, Frank Perdue was a shy man. And the idea of having thousands of people troop through his home, it was so far out of his comfort zone. But 6 weeks later, we did start. It was 100 at a time. We started with the administrative assistants with the very deliberate idea that they could tell everybody else that our parties were fun and not scary. Well, I mean, imagine, I'm just going to pick employee categories out of the air, but imagine you're a trucker or, I don't know, veterinarian, whoever, and you haven't like mingled in high society. And Frank was part of the Forbes 400, that it might be kind of intimidating to go to the big boss's house. So our thought was, if we invite people, groups of 100 who know each other, like the truckers, the veterinarians, the accountants, anybody, that if you're, safety in numbers. So we very deliberately invited people in groups that would know each other. And then, we also know that, I'm going to guess, Fran, that you totally take it for granted that how to behave at a cocktail party, but not everybody does. And we knew that. And I haven't grown up in the hospitality industry. I kind of think that I've got antenna out for what's going to make somebody comfortable or miserable. And so to get around the problem of you stand around and you don't know what to say, the place where our home was, we had a tennis court, we had a badminton court, we had a volleyball court, we had horseshoes, we had a pool table. And the thing is, I would ask people in the invitation to dress for their sport. And I said it's against the rules to buy anything new, because I don't want people spending their hard-earned money on a social occasion that they might never wear the things again. So dress for your sport. And that way people come in, and if you know about volleyball or tennis or whatever, you're off and running. But supposing you're more of a spectator, well, watch somebody playing pool, play horseshoes. So that way, the party would just start off with people mingling with people that they know and are comfortable with. And then one of the things that I think was just extraordinary about Frank, I'm going to take credit for it's being my idea, but boy, did he run with that ball, because our living room, we had a series of like long buffet tables. How about they're in one great big row? Because we're serving 100 people. Frank would stand behind the buffet table along with some of the other kitchen helpers, and he would wait on his employees. I mean, can you imagine waiting on your employee? But he did it with a full heart, because as far as I can tell, his attitude was every single person is equally important. And then at the end of the evening, he'd take questions from the employees, as we call them associates. And I think that's got to be fabulous for employee engagement and feeling that you're part of things. If you can talk with the big boss about whatever it is that you really care about, and then at the end of the evening, he'd say, in different words each time, but it would boil down to the company wouldn't be what it is today without each of you. Thank you. And what must that mean to somebody fairly far down in the organization to have dinner at the big boss's house and be thanked by him and waited on by him?
There's 2 leadership principles that both your father and Frank spoke about that in my conversations with you in getting to know you, I believe you exude so much of. And I'm wondering, I actually hadn't planned on doing this, but I kind of just want to throw them out there, and I want to get your definition. And the first one is making someone feel that they're the most important person in the room in your interaction. Can you define that a little bit?
I'll describe it since it's most recent, watching Frank. I mean, personally, I just feel really fortunate that I got to spend a lot of time with him. And as a writer, I mean, this is a really cool thing, because I could go be taking notes of what he did. And one of the things that I noticed, to make somebody feel important, listen to them. I think that's just key. But when he was listening to somebody, I used to notice that in interactions, he would only speak 10% of the time, whether it was at a board meeting or a sales meeting or talking with a taxi or a bartender, whoever he was interacting with. That person at the time that he's interacting with him or her, he's asking questions and then listening 90% of the time, sort of watching him. In my own mind, I'd describe it as, you're the most important person in the world. Look. I mean, he just looked at the person as if that person's the most important person in the world. And I believe at that moment, that person was. I mean, it wasn't a question of Frank looking around the room to see if there was somebody more important to talk with. No, when he's talking with you, you were just enveloped. Frank had a lot of charisma, but you were just enveloped in almost, I don't know, his aura of you are important to him. He just communicated that.
And that's hard to do now. And that's something that I've tried to be conscious of in my conversations with leaders. And I had a guy who worked for me, I'd say with me, because he followed me to a couple of different jobs. And he's an amazing, one of the most proficient people I've ever worked with. And I was in a meeting with him once, and I had my iPhone on the table. I had my iWatch, my Apple Watch on my wrist, and they were going off. And I kept looking at my wrist every time it went on. And he put his notebook down on the table and he said, do you want to handle that? And this is a moment where I'm a senior executive in this company. This is one of my department heads, but one of my employees who has now, in a sense, called me out and said, you're being rude. I've waited. And now, mind you, I should caveat that this meeting that we were having, we actually had tried to have 2 or 3 times. I kept having to cancel it. And he'd been preparing for this. And at that moment that he said that to me, I put my phone down and I took my watch off because I'm like, you know what? He's right. I'm rude because this is a meeting that he's been waiting to have with me. This is important stuff. And I need to be focused on this. And I always keep that in the back of my mind. And as I read this in your book and as I hear you tell the story, I think about that moment and these, because it is so important and so impactful that people understand, number one, that you care about what they're saying, but that you as a leader actually can focus. Because if you can't focus, you don't hear them. And that's a wasted interaction.
And speaking of wasted interactions, I have an opinion that a lot of conversations, you're listening to the person, but not very much because you're thinking what you're going to answer back. And as far as I can tell, Frank didn't do that. He was totally listening. And then in the moment, he'd respond to whatever they had said. It wasn't as if you've said something and he's off and running thinking of something else. No, he's totally in the moment of listening to you and then responding to what you said.
The second principle is no one is as smart as all of us.
Yeah. And I came across this when I was noticing, again, his listening skills. Say he'd be with a group of salesmen or veterinarians or accountants or anybody at all, but maybe they're 10 or 12 and he's attending a meeting. And I've already stipulated that I am a writer, so it's my business to notice things like this. I used to notice that when he'd come into the room, he's Mr. Big. He's the person whose name appears on their paychecks. And you could expect that the super alpha man, which Frank was, that when he'd walk into one of these rooms, that he'd have a leader's posture of shoulders back, standing straight, big arm gestures, taking up commanding room. Have I explained that well enough? That somebody who takes up space is indicating that they're the boss? Frank didn't do that.
This is a really good concept because people will say, oh, that person owns the room. When they come in, you just know.
Yeah, I mean, that's real. People who study body language, Amy Cudahy, for example, says that, this is notice it from now on if you haven't noticed it yet, but that people do come in and you can tell who owns the room. But Frank Perdue did not do that. When he'd come in, he'd have posture of, how about just taking up less space? Maybe his shoulders, instead of being back and chest out, would be sort of almost humble. And he didn't have his head way back. It was almost slightly downcast, slightly looking up. He was communicating through body language that he wanted to hear everybody else. And the phrase that he used and that you just quoted, none of us is as smart as all of us, the PS to that phrase was, there's a lot of knowledge, wisdom, and experience in this room, and my job is to tap into it. And I don't want them to know what I want to hear. I want their ideas. And I wrote a book on Frank, a biography. I interviewed 134 people for it. And one of the things that I heard over and over again, when I'm interviewing people, was they would comment that at any of these meetings, they didn't know what answer he wanted. He would just play that card really close to the chest. And the reason why, again, is that he wanted their knowledge, wisdom, talent, experience, that, there's no point to the meeting unless you're there to hear them. And Frank was very aware that people have a tendency to bend into a pretzel to say what the boss wants to hear, but they can't do it if they don't know what he wants to hear.
I like that. I like that phrase, bend into a pretzel. I'm going to use that. He had a award that he gave out that rewarded failure. It was called the Great Failed Project Award. This is a concept that we speak about in many episodes here on the podcast. And Laura Wilkinson spoke about it not too long ago. And she's an Olympic diver, a gold medalist. And she has a great phrase and says, every time I fail, it's an opportunity to learn.
Ah.
And I read this about Frank and Perdue Farms, where there's an award for failure. And Mike Sorelli from The Talent Worker talks about rewarding failure, having the courage as a leader to reward failure and go to someone and say, hey, that's okay. We accept it. We learn from it. Now get at it and do something else. Can you talk more about that award?
Okay. Frank was very conscious of the importance for awards for a culture, because an award in general, it's not about handing somebody a certificate or a gift or something. No, that's 5% of what awards are about. 95% of awards are communicating to the rest of the company what we value and what's important and what's rewarded. So the cultural aspects, which he was just keenly aware of, the cultural aspect of an award is 95% of it, what it communicates to everybody else. Well, there was a guy, his name was Owen Schweers, and he had a particular specialty, something that he'd studied in college. It was package design. And, this is what he does 8 hours a day, if not 12 hours a day, designing, the most perfect packages that you can have. Well, one day he had a really great idea. It was there's a very standard box that you pack chickens in, and they fit on the trucks. And I think most chicken companies probably have something similar. But Owen's idea was, if you made the box just a little bit longer and a little less high, you'd have it would weigh 40 pounds, which is something that pallets hold well and so forth. But if you just change the shape of it slightly, you could improve how much it would fit in the trucks by maybe 10%. And how about that counts for an enormous amount? Because at that time we had 5,000 trucks. And if you make fewer trips, you're saving time, you're saving the environment, just in every count.
Yeah, the realization rate's going up on everything.
Yeah, I mean, it should have been fabulous. Well, came the time for the great unveiling, and you pilot things like this, and it was going to be in New York, the toughest market, and the buyers hated it. The receivers hated it. They were used to what they were used to, and they couldn't tell that it was the same weight. I mean, if you took it to a scale, you'd know, but just by lifting it, because the weight's distributed a little different, it seemed lighter. It wasn't, but it seemed so. And Frank was actually visiting different buyers, getting their reactions. And since they hated it, and since Frank's mantra was the customer's always right, even though it objectively was a far better package, it had to go. But that meant telling poor Owen Schweers that something that he had spent a year on and put his heart into and all his professional expertise, that in the marketplace it failed. Well, Owen Schweers was just devastated by this. Frank knew that would be the case. So Frank got the board of directors of the company, and maybe let's say there are 7 of them. He created this great big, and I haven't seen it, but it's been described. I think it's probably like 2 feet by 3 feet, and it was bronze, and it was huge. And as I said, engraved was the names of the entire board of directors. And the title on this engraving thing, it was bronze on a wooden plaque or a walnut plaque. And it said to Owen Schweers, the recipient of the Great Failed Project Award. And they brought him in and presented this to him. And he told me it was one of the best things that ever happened in his life, because there's a huge element of humor to it. And humor takes away the sting of a disappointment. But it also meant a lot to him that Frank wasn't saying, oh, awful you. No, it was celebrating the effort that he'd put into it. But I bet everybody would take different I don't know, messages from that. But the one that I take is that Frank was empathetic enough to know this guy's going to be feeling really bad and he needs to be bucked up. He needs to be encouraged. And this is a really cool way to do it. Actually, I know it's your show and you get to ask the questions, but can I ask one?
Please, go ahead.
Thank you. I don't want to be rude. Yes, I do. All right, the real Mitzi comes out.
No more acting. That's it.
Yeah, the real, off comes the mask. I just mentioned that what I take out of that was that Frank was enormously insightful and empathetic, which by my way, my father would have done. I mean, he wouldn't have done the same thing, but he would have understood. What message do you take out of the Great Failed Project Award?
I take the message of if you don't push people to failure, they won't try. And people won't push themselves to failure if there's a fear of repercussion. I think that you see it in athletics, you see it in business. There's people who will always push because they don't fear failure. They say, look, if I fall down, if I get knocked out, if I don't make it, that's okay because I will have now learned my limit. Once I understand my limit, I understood what it took to get to that limit. Now I understand what it takes to surpass it. And then they'll make the necessary improvements. And there's a element of humility to this too, because you have to be able to internalize, okay, why did I fail? Why did I not get to that end state that I set for myself? If you sit there and you blame others and say, well, the environment was bad. I was hungry. I was tired. My boss didn't support me. I didn't have the resources. Then you're never going to actually accept that there's probably another reason that actually didn't fail. Maybe the concept was bad. Maybe you were not prepared. You won't learn, right? Yeah, exactly. You're not learning that you can make necessary adjustments to now become successful the next time you do that. So as a leader, the ability to look at someone and say, it's okay if you fail. I want you to push. I want you to go to the limit. I want you to understand where that is. And if you cross that limit and it doesn't work out, that's okay because I now have assumed that risk. I've pushed you to do that. And I want you to do that because now the next time we go and approach something, you're going to be more willing to find the new limit and break through it. And that's where innovation happens. That's where organizations move forward, individuals and teams move forward at a much faster pace when it's okay when things don't go well.
It's funny that we're on that because this is something I've been obsessing over for the last couple of days. And it began with a conversation with a Chinese American friend that I'm really close to. I mean, we're close enough so that we call each other brother and sister. So it's a close relationship and we can say things to each other. And he was telling me he's passionately pro-America and he's kind of mad at where his ancestors came from. And he said that he thinks that America is always going to do better long-term than the country that his ancestors came from. And the reason why is because he said, here, you can fail, which means that you're going to dare to try lots of things. Their failure is punished. And he just thought that this was a huge advantage that this country has, that you can fail.
You have to be allowed to fail and you have to be willing to fail. If you're not, you're never going to get there. Doesn't matter what you're doing. Doesn't matter if it's physically, emotionally, in business, personally, professionally. Understanding the limit and pushing through it is what we're here for. We are put on earth to do better, to drive things forward. If we don't understand the limits of failure, we'll never figure out how to get past them. And if we're always fearful of what happens when we fail, we'll never stand up again and say, let's do it.
Actually, that's kind of the story of my career, because up until like age 38, I hadn't done much with my education. I was a rice grower, which I loved, but my real dream, somewhat like yours, was broadcasting. I really wanted, communication and also writing. And what had held me back was I was so devastated by the thought of failing an audition or getting the rejection slips that I didn't even try. But then in the magic year when I was 38, I decided to redefine failure. Failure wasn't that you don't get to your immediate objective. No, failure is when you don't try and give it your all. Because even when, to an outsider, it might look like that you were rejected or failed an audition or whatever, you have learned so much in the process that you're farther ahead. So by redefining failure, I became a TV hostess, a radio host, and a syndicated columnist.
And one of the most syndicated columnists, I think, ever as well. Well, we should say that.
Well, in my field as an environmental writer, there was a period when I was the most widely syndicated columnist. Yay!
Hey, your story behind that is interesting, though, because you were so fearful of standing up and speaking in front of people that you actually had to take a course for it.
I would say that it was a phobia, the equivalent of snakes or dying. I'm worried that you won't believe me because I figured that there's nothing shy about me now. But again, up until something like age 38, I was so shy, it was hard for me to enter a room. The idea of entering a room full of strangers, terror, which, by the way, I think makes me a good hostess because it made me empathetic with the associates at Perdue who would be coming to our home. That there will be, if you have a group of 100, there will be some people who are shy and uncomfortable. But back to the story of needing to take a course. In my life, I haven't counted, but I bet I've taken 7 or 8 public speaking courses because it didn't come natural to me. I'm just complete total terror of public speaking. And that's long since gone. I mean, now I look forward to it the way I'd look forward to a date with somebody I really liked.
Now you're up in front of thousands.
Woo! Hi, everybody. I want to be friends with you. Want to talk with you.
But I think that's an amazing testament, though, to your character as well. And we should hit it here because you're a lifelong learner. I mean, you're someone who is always focused on learning.
But you know what? From my experience, 8 years in television, which I left to marry Frank, but I'm back in television again with EarthX TV. But when things went wrong, I'd get much more fan letters than when they were perfect. When I was in television, which I was for 8 years, I learned something that was staggering to me, which is when things didn't go right on a half-hour television show, the amazing thing was I'd get 20, 30 times more fan mail than when a show had gone perfectly. And I came to the conclusion, the conviction, that people like you for being human a lot more than they like you for being perfect. So if there's some noise in the background, actually I'm thinking, woohoo, human.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, people want genuine. They don't want to see a fake. They don't want people who look like they're putting on a show. If they can see who you really are. I mean, it's why on social media, you can post so many cool things about what you do all day. And then if you post a picture of your family, it gets 10x the amount of views and likes.
Yeah, I mean, well, again, rude guest asking you a question, but doesn't it sort of feel that in your own personal experience that you like people who are authentic and human and warts and all rather than perfection? And in the National Speakers Association, one of the things that I've learned, because to be part of this, well, it's recommended that you take a year-long course in public speaking. And one of the things that I walked away with from this year-long course is that the deeper it comes from you, the deeper it reaches your audience. So to the extent that you're just perfectly reciting something just ideal, you're probably going to lose them and they're thinking of their shopping lists or last night's romantic encounter or whatever.
I've had that happen in the preparation for events where if I've tried to script it out, you end up getting lost in the script. And then if you miss a word, you realize you missed a word and then it's not as genuine. And then it comes across that you're reading something versus if you can just get up there and speak from the heart, tell the story. It may not be the same every single time. There might be a few nuances, but if you can be comfortable in that, then the genuineness of that conversation is going to outweigh maybe some of the finer words or points that you missed if you had scripted the whole thing out because you're not coming across like a robot.
Yeah, like I even experienced that recently. It was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, earlier in the summer. And I was present at a breakfast where I wasn't really expecting to speak, but I happened to be standing and somebody asked a question, put a microphone in my hand on a subject that, how about I know I've never spoken on before. And I'm thinking, to myself, I'm thinking, OMG.
What am I going to say?
Yeah, but then there came echoing back in my head something from the National Speakers Association, which they said, the reason improv, the humor of improv, reaches you so deeply is because it's in the moment. There's nothing scripted about improv. And so your goal as a speaker is to be like somebody on a high wire without a net, just talk. And the most amazing, it's never happened to me before, but I want to try it again because it was nice. At the end of my talking for like 15 minutes, people were yelling and screaming approval. I've never had such an intense, intimate interaction with an audience as when I had to speak completely unprepared.
But then you have to weigh, are we in a situation where I'm just winging it or are we just going to see what happens?
How about a fruitful combination of both? I mean, trust me, I was winging it. And I was very curious to see. I mean, this was my test. Is the National Speakers Association right? That I don't want to be unfair to them or give a wrong impression, because they really want you to know your stuff and they want you to practice on everybody like 40 times before you get paid for it. They're very into preparation. But they do say that when it's improv, it can be highly effective, and don't be afraid of it. And I've always been so afraid of it that I never put myself voluntarily in the position of it's happening. But when it did, good Lord, I mean, woohoo, I want to do that again.
So as we close out, the Jedburghs, they did three things to be successful. They had to do three things to be successful in their everyday world. They had to be able to shoot. They had to be able to move. They had to be able to communicate. These were the foundational core tasks of their job. If they did these three things successfully every day, it didn't matter what challenges came their way. They would find solutions to those problems because they could focus on them. They didn't have to worry about the three things that set them up for success. What are the three things that you do every day that set the conditions for you to be successful in everything else?
All right. The first thing I do is I eat a live frog.
What?
That was the correct response. No, this is an idea that comes from Mark Twain. And he said that it's a really good idea to do the most difficult, unpleasant job that's going to face you during the day. And he calls that your live frog. And if you have two really difficult, unpleasant things to get through, eat the biggest live frog first. So I try very hard in the course of a day. I go through actually, this is another tip that I have, which is I do have a list that I prepare the night before of the things I want to get done that day. And in the morning, I fire up my laptop and I see what's on that list. And then I figure out which is the live frog. And I do that first. And the absolute joy of that is then this heavy, difficult, effortful thing is behind you and it's not hanging over you the rest of the day. And it's such a good feeling because a live frog, metaphorically speaking, your metaphorical live frog is probably something, if it's that hard and that's difficult, it's probably pretty important and impactful. Anyway, so to have that under your belt, you can just motor through the rest of the day because you've done the hardest thing.
Yeah, that's great. Because so many times we get up and we do 5 or 6 different small things. And then it's the middle of the day and we still realize, we still have to do this, which is the real thing we actually had to do today.
All right, making a list and eating the live frog first. And let's see what the third one would be. Well, I have an attitude, which is I try extremely hard simply not to process negative stuff. Like when I was writing my autobiography, I had a miserable first marriage. I was incapable of writing how difficult and bad and ghastly it was because it's as if I forbid my mind to focus on the negative, but instead I want to focus on things that energize me and make me want to leap over tall buildings in a single bound, which, by the way, being 80 years old, that's quite an achievement.
I think you do it every day.
Anyway, those are my three. Positive mental attitude, make a list, and eat that live frog first.
Those three are truly amazing. We spoke about it earlier, and in every Jedburgh podcast, we highlight the 9 characteristics of elite performance: drive, resiliency, adaptability, humility, integrity, effective intelligence, team ability, curiosity, and emotional strength. And we say that in order to be an elite performer, you have to exhibit all 9 of these characteristics as part of you. And rarely do you exhibit all of them at the same time, but based on the situation that you're in, you'll demonstrate a couple of them at different times. And even though we say that, I then look at each one of my guests and I say, well, if I had to define you in one, what would that be? And for you, I think of integrity, understanding what's right and aligning your principles, your actions, and your words to that right. I think about the Sheraton Hotel brand, Perdue Farms, Win This Fight, taking care of people, the hospitality of the highest standard. And you exhibit that every single day. Your family is a household name that's touched every single one of us. You're the daughter and wife of visionaries. You're a transformative leader yourself. And at 80 years old, you said it, you're still leaping tall buildings and climbing mountains. And before we even got on today, you were talking about a course that you're in. And there's not many 80-year-old people who are still looking to educate themselves. And that's the drive, And so there's integrity, but that's a drive to always do better, always be better. You've overcome a lot of things in your life to become so amazingly successful. And you're impactful to all of us and instrumental in these organizations that you grew up in. And I do want to say that there's a quote from your mother that you've highlighted, and I want to conclude with it. And that's, quote, "The givers of the world are happy. The takers of the world are miserable. If you want to be happy, think of what you can do for someone else. If you want to be miserable, think about what's owed to you," unquote. Those are truly words to live by. We have to tell everybody, text Elevate to 55312, make a donation, whatever you can. We're going to put it on everything. Eat the live frog first every day. And now we have to go find you Paris Hilton as well to get you linked up. Thank you so much. I've loved this conversation. I love getting to know you. I look forward to many more conversations with you. And thank you for joining me on the Jedburgh podcast.
Thank you so much. It's been pure joy beginning to end, at least for me.
Same here. American Jedburghs went on to form the foundation of the United States Special Forces and the Special Activities Directorate of the Central Intelligence Agency. Thanks for listening to the Jedburgh podcast. I'm your host, Fran Racioppi. We're brought to you by the Talent War Group, an executive search firm and talent advisory. We'll drive you to attract, retain, and develop top talent. With services like talent acquisition, leadership development, and keynote speeches, we work with you to create talent solutions to business problems. To get started, visit talentwargroup.com. Join us next week for a new episode of the Jedburgh podcast on Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, and iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you heard, give us a like and leave a review. Follow me, Fran Racioppi, the Talent War Group, and the Jedburgh podcast on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, and send your comments and inquiries to media@talentwargroup.com. As former members of Special Operations Forces, the Jedburgh podcast and the Talent War Group contribute a percentage of all profits to the Special Operations Warrior Foundation, supporting the families of our fallen warriors. Thanks for joining us on this episode. How you prepare today determines success tomorrow.